Welcome to TYT Interviews. Michael Shure here in Los Angeles, and today we're going to be talking about a fascinating book about a part of American history that we keep being reminded of. Professor Timothy Tyson has written this book. It's called The Blood of Emmett Till. It's a book that talks about the case, about the trial, but it brings up something that we have never had access to before. And we'll let Professor Tyson talk to us about that. Timothy Tyson is a professor of, this is what's amazing. The day after the Duke, North Carolina game, we're talking to somebody who is a professor at both schools. He's the senior research scholar at the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University, visiting professor of American Christianity and Southern Culture at Duke University Divinity School, and adjunct professor of American Studies at the University of North Carolina. So I see, Professor, a conflict of interest.
It's worse than it looks. It's worse than it looks. I'm actually married to a UNC grad, so it's I have to watch what I say here.
And you're speaking to a UVA grad, so I don't like any of you. So let's start out talking like that.
At least you understand that these are religious issues.
I do.
Yes.
I do. Yeah, sometimes divinity might be the wrong word when you're talking about basketball down there. Professor, first of all, thank you for your time. Thank you for taking the time to write this book. I think a lot of people who have read your work have read you address a story that's quite similar to the Emmett Till story, in that it happened 15 years later, and there are kinds of stories that are repeated throughout our racial history. Tell us a little bit about Blood Done Sign My Name, and how that may have inspired you to look at the Till case.
The summer that I turned 11, the father of a boy that I played with almost every day, and his two older brothers, murdered a young black man named Henry Marrow in Oxford, North Carolina. He had Marrow was a 23-year-old Vietnam veteran. He had gone into the Till's store and then was allegedly made some kind of flirtatious remark to the young white woman who was working at the counter. Her kinsman, led by Robert Till, the father, chased him out of the store, shot him in the back, 200 feet off their property, running as fast as he could, went over and beat his head in with the stocks of the weapons, and then just shot him between the eyes, like you'd kill a snake. This happened in public, wasn't a murder mystery. And much of the town went up in flames. It's a little tobacco market town, and much of the downtown area was burned up in arson by black Vietnam veterans who were home and who were angry, of course, at one of their number being murdered, and also, of course, it was 1970 in the wake of the King assassination and really the fragmentation of the country. But anyway, I went back when I was a freshman in college working on a paper and interviewed the murderer. And that eventually, 20-some years later, became a book called Blood Done Sign My Name, which is my third book, but it was a personal book. It was both a historical book, but also kind of a memoir piece. And that in fact is what led Carolyn Bryant to me. Her daughter-in-law called me on the telephone 8 years ago or so now.
And let me just interrupt, Professor. Carolyn Bryant was a witness, and we'll talk about the Till case as well, in the framework of what you just said, because it's so eerily similar. It started. This is your intimate story. I think that a lot of people feel intimate about the Till case, who had never even been to Mississippi, and it started in Greenwood, Mississippi, at the Milam's grocery store, and it was about a boy, Emmett Till, who was down visiting family from Chicago and Mississippi in the summertime, having whistled at, allegedly, perhaps touched, perhaps made remarks to a white woman whose kinsman did the same thing, just not in public, and later that night to Emmett Till, and that's a brief way of recapping it. But Carolyn Bryant was a woman who gave testimony in the courtroom, sometimes in front of the jury, sometimes not. But it was her testimony that a lot of people think led to what happened to Emmett Till. And you, for the very first time in the history of this case, in our history, were able to sit down with this woman, and a lot changed. So talk about, I interrupted you because I want our audience to understand a little bit of the history of it as well.
Yeah, Carolyn Bryant's testimony actually is not what led to Emmett Till's death. He was already dead.
Right, I'm sorry, right. That led to
Right.
the acquittal, the acquittal of the people that killed her. Yeah.
She apparently did not tell her husband. What happened was this harmless exchange at the store, which angered her. It violated her racial sensibilities of Jim Crow, Mississippi, 1955. But an annoying 14-year-old boy, and someone who was hanging around the store told her husband when he got back, which was he had been out of town, and her husband, her brother-in-law, and a number of several other of her kinsmen went, and a family friend went and kidnapped Emmett Till and tortured him to death and sank his body in the Tallahatchie River. Carolyn's part in that is unknown and unknowable. But it's the thing that we've just learned, that the big sort of media focus at the moment is this revelation from her that she had lied at the trial. This was not exactly the morning news to me, or anybody else that who really knows much about the case, because it was pretty obvious that she was not telling the truth. The jury was not in the room when she testified. What she testified to was something tantamount to sexual assault. But if she had gone in and stood on her head and screamed, "They lynched him! They lynched him! He didn't do anything wrong! They lynched him!" They would have been acquitted. Right. It's not. So it's not, that wasn't decisive. It is revealing and important, a revelation, but it's not really the focus of the book. It's not, this is not Carolyn's story, and it's not Carolyn's book or focusing on her or anything. She's an important news source, and the interview did reveal things about their family, for instance, that were interesting and made it easier to piece together how this happened. But the main story is really about not just about this horrifying tragedy, this brutal crime, but really what happens in the wake of it.
So much has been, Paul Henderson wrote a book called Sons of Mississippi, which you may or may not have written. It's about the wake of things. Yeah, it's about what happens after big events, and it was also focused on Mississippi. And I think when we look at what happened after the Till case, and you're right, I misspoke before. Of course, he was already dead. That's why there was the trial, and it was her testimony that, like you said, she could have stood on her head and said those things, and that was what it was like for, white people in court with an all-white jury at that time in Mississippi. But I think when you say it's what we learned afterwards, and when you hear that 15 years later you were able to write a book about essentially the same thing happening, not exactly the same, of course, and we can cut also to 2012, and you had Trayvon Martin, and you see in the public square these events happen. What is it that you took away after writing this book, in depth about the trial, in depth about the people involved, that you took away from the experience of writing it?
The Emmett Till's mother, Mamie Bradley, was both courageous and also politically astute. And she immediately, upon hearing this terrible news, decided to take her own private agony and her own personal heartbreak and make it into a public and political issue. She then, she had his body shipped back from Chicago, mangled, bloated, a horrifying sight. Had an open casket funeral, so the world could see what racial segregation had done to her boy. Even before the body got back, she got on the telephone and started calling reporters and other people. And what she did was she leveraged the institutions of Black Chicago, which had been built up over 6 and 7 decades. Things like the Chicago Defender, the largest African American newspaper in the country, the Johnson Publication Organization, which was Ebony and Jet, and about 10 other publications, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and a number of other Black labor unions, the Dawson Political Machine, which was the most powerful Black political organization probably in the world, but certainly in the country. The United Packing House Workers, an interracial union with Black leadership, fast becoming a civil rights union. Lots of progressive churches, the NAACP, which in Chicago was led by labor union militants. All of those organizations had a national reach. And what they did was to organize a national movement. That was the big surprise to me. I had not realized, I knew there were protests. I did not realize that these things were coast to coast, involved hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people, that they went on for a couple of years, that they provided the infrastructure for a national civil rights movement to emerge. The Till case is decisive. It inspires the Montgomery bus boycott, provides a lot of funding for it. The civil rights movement before this is local movements across the South. Those local movements, remain the heart of the civil rights movement. But this gives them a national infrastructure that elevates Martin Luther King to a national and eventual world historical status, passes the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1968, smashes the legal, formal racial caste system in America. And the Till case is pivotal to all of that.
And Mamie Bradley, Emmett Till's mother, became a celebrity, right? She would go around the country, and throngs of people would come out.
She was absolutely relentless for the rest of her life in explaining what had happened to her son and what it meant, and what it meant in American history and who we are and who we would be. She was remarkable.
Yeah, and one of the things that I find so striking, and both in your pages and in the general history of this case, is that, the photograph, the famous photograph of Emmett Till's body, open casket in Chicago, a horrific mangled photograph. And I should say that there are no photographs in this book, which I think is great, because the world has seen it, and now the story about it should be as compelling. But it didn't just horrify people and call for change. It inspired Black people in America to get out of their houses and do something that they hadn't done before.
Yes.
And it was that moment, can you talk a little bit about how pivotal that was? I mean, you just did in terms of inspiring the movement, but what are the specifics of that? Like, what came of that? A. Philip Randolph talking to all his sleeping car porters, but then 6 months later, or maybe even fewer months later, 4 months later, Rosa Parks gets on a bus in Montgomery. How tied together are those?
In some ways, this begins with two points. One, you've got Mamie Bradley in Chicago, which is kind of the capital of Black America, and all the power of of Black Chicago. And then you've got the what I call the Mississippi Underground, but it's this network of Black activists, grassroots activists across Mississippi. They are pivotal in the trial. They essentially do the investigation, produce all the witnesses that happened at the trial. But then after the acquittals...
And let me just interrupt, Professor. One of the things that I thought was so great in your book is they also hid the witnesses, right? I mean, they protected the witnesses while they were down there.
This had to, and every African-American in Mississippi who testified at that trial, later the day that they testified was moving to Chicago. It was either, leave or die. I mean, and that was an important thing to understand about their testimony and the courage that they showed.
Yeah.
But yeah, Dr. T.R.M. Howard, who was a African American grassroots activist in Mississippi, spoke at Dexter Street Baptist Church in Montgomery shortly after the acquittals, and he was invited by this unknown minister named Martin Luther King, and Rosa Parks was in the congregation. She was deeply moved by his firsthand sort of story about Emmett Till. 4 days later, she was asked to move to the back of a bus in Montgomery, and she said later, I thought about Emmett Till, and I couldn't move. Then, so another really pivotal moment in the transformation of this country's race relations was the sit-in movement in 1960, when young people sat in at lunch counters all across the country. It started in North Carolina and then grew across the South, and involving thousands and thousands of people. And really, the sit-ins turned the civil rights movement into a mass movement, turned it into a youth-driven movement, very energetic confrontation with white supremacy, and also into a movement fundamentally grounded in nonviolent direct action. So the young people who organized the sit-in movement, and there was barely a grown-up in the South who was in favor of the sit-in movement. This was a youth thing. They were all Emmett Till's age. John Lewis, who was 20, Emmett Till was his age, and he said he thought at the time it could be me at the bottom of that river. But Julian Bond, John Lewis, a whole generation of African American young people, they call themselves the Emmett Till generation, literally, in the words of people the organizers of the sit-in movement, called themselves the Emmett Till generation. And all of them traced their involvement in the movement to the moment when they saw that photograph from Jet magazine. It led them straight to their efforts to change the country.
Yeah, I think that's one of the underreported parts of when the civil rights movement began. A lot of people think that it began when Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on a bus, but it all traces back, it seems, to this galvanized movement, traces back to the Till case. What about today? And I want to. We'll have a chance to go to a couple of things in the book as well that I wanted to ask you about. But what about today? And what about the Till case's effect on the way we see race relations in America today? A lot of young people today say, it's terrible, it's horrible. It's not Emmett Till days, but is it?
Well, the Till case became a kind of symbol of American racial injustice and the violence beneath our racial caste system, and the incredible depths of brutality to which the country had descended over and over again for a long time. So this became a kind of symbol of that, and it's a story that continues to speak to people, and it has been. And the Black Lives Matter generation, you see them, thousands out in front of the White House in 2014 chanting, Michael Brown, Emmett Till, how many black kids will you kill? And his name is regularly invoked at their protests and rallies. Say his name, Emmett Till. When it comes time to say the names of Walter Scott and Eric Garner and Trayvon Martin and Sandra Bland and on, Emmett Till's name is always in the mix, always listed as one of the. So it continues to speak to people, and I think in part because of deep down, I think we know that it's not just the horrifying brutality that confronts us in the world, but it's what we do with it. Right. That's what the thing is. Not just crucifixion. It's resurrection. What are you going to do with this thing?
And would the Emmett Till generation think that we've done enough?
Oh, well, no. I mean, they're demanding justice now and fundamental change. They're focusing on the the violence toward young African American men in this country, and also the ruthless indifference to young African American men in this country, and the way that our our criminal justice system is chewing up generations of young black men and devastating black communities, and making the streets less safe.
Right.
You know, putting people into prison who are far less dangerous than the people who are coming out of prison. In other words, the whole system is greatly dysfunctional and also destructive to African American communities. So that's a piece of it. It's a really important. But those issues. My sense of it is that criminal justice and police violence are important in and of themselves, but they also stand in for enduring inequalities of race and disparities of race, and the question of whether or not African Americans are full and legal citizens in this country and can expect a full share in American life, and which is the question that has plagued America since before the birth of the country. What was to be the role of the sons and daughters of Africa? Were they human beings? Were they citizens? What was the meaning of what was their meaning and place in the role of this country? Still wrestling with that.
Yeah, listening to what you're saying right now, listening to your last few sentences, made me think of the title of your book, "The Blood of Emmett Till," and I'm not going to explain. The way I interpret it, though, is that we're still stained by the blood of Emmett Till in our race relations. Is that why you used that title to a degree?
Well, there's a great scene that I like very much in the early day, the Albany movement in Southwest Georgia in 1962. Martin Luther King was coming down to lead a march
with Charles Sherrod, right?
Pardon me?
Was that the Charles Sherrod?
Yeah, that's the place. That's exactly, yeah. And so he's coming down to lead a march, and he gets hit with a federal injunction not to march. Well, he didn't really want to defy federal courts, because the federal courts in general were the friends of the movement.
Right.
So he went down to announce to this immense crowd at the church that, well, we can't march because I'm under a federal injunction. And he did that. And then there's this murmuring through the crowd. And then Reverend Samuel Wells came and just sort of stepped across into the podium and said, I don't know about you. There's no federal injunction on me. The blood of Emmett Till cries from the ground, and we've got to march. Not tomorrow, not at high noon, right now. And then just led the people on.
And they just walked out of the church and marched.
They just walked out of the church and marched. And anyway, it's a compelling moment. But
and it was, by the way, the Albany that night was a very bloody night. I mean, it was in its own right was that part of the movement. So
that is important story that we really haven't told in any kind of fullness. But anyway, the blood is a word that we use to talk about race, to talk about family, to talk about violence, to talk about the deep commitments that we have. That was to me the blood of Emmett Till. It's also sort of what came of this. It's not and in my faith tradition, of course, blood is both violence, but it's also redemption. The possibility of changing things is really at the heart of what I have found in my research and feel that the Till story means in the last instance.
Right. I want to go to the book quickly before we let you go and talk to you. One of actually early in the book, you say, what does it mean when you remember something that never happened? That's that happens in trials, but sometimes things get put into our mind. How does that apply to this case and your work?
Well, the specific reference is to Carolyn Bryant, when she told me with respect to the physical, sexual menacing account that she gave in court about her encounter with Emmett Till. She said to me, with reference to that, that part's not true. So naturally enough, my next question was, what did happen then? And she paused and said, honestly, I'd like to tell you, but I don't really remember. It was more than 50 years ago. And then she said, in a very thoughtful way, it may not sound that way to somebody who wasn't there, but she said, you tell these stories until they seem true, but that part's not true. And then she said, she sort of paused and said, nothing that boy did could ever justify what happened to him. I think she was, I'm not trying to apologize for Carolyn, or it's not it's not a favorable account of Carolyn's role in this thing, but I did think she was trying to distinguish between what happened and what she could remember. We all tell these family stories.
Right.
They get kind of polished off over the years.
That's right.
And they're not true anymore exactly. They're not sort of factual, but they have meaning. We tell them over and over again because they have meaning for us.
Right.
They do tell a truth. It's just not sort of the truth.
Right.
And
we forget a detail and we add a detail.
She was just trying to say, I'm not a really good source for the exact details.
Right.
And what I sort of remember is not actually true.
And through the perspective of history,
yeah,
right. Yeah. Through the perspective of history, she is the only source, and so that's what we, it's when we have a relative who died, and we can't remember that.
We do have another story from Carolyn.
Yeah,
I obtained the notes written by her attorney back in 1955. She was interviewed by the attorney. Her husband was in jail. Emmett Till's body had just been found. The family's attorney interviewed her, took very careful notes, wanted to know what her story was about what happened at the store. She told a story, I think she used the word insulted. She told the story of an obnoxious boy, somebody who irritated her, violated her racial sensibilities, but anyway, made her mad. There's nothing in that account that's physical, sexual, could in any way be construed as assault. So I knew that. And so that was a story she told, in private to her attorney soon after the events in question happened. So I am inclined to believe that they are, in large measure at least, factual. And they bear no resemblance to her account in court, which is more like a sexual assault. But the story she tells in court is an old American story about the black beast rapist, and the fairest flower of white womanhood. This is a narrative of political purpose, a lie that was told against African-American men in the late 19th century, portraying black men as a threat to white women, as a way of whipping white men into line and getting them to vote against their own interests by shaming them, and using the sexual violence as a kind of the ultimate leverage point. It's a story. You didn't hear anything about enslaved African American men attacking white women on the plantation. You didn't hear that. But when African Americans were voting and becoming citizens and taking some small measure of civic power in America, and that to justify repressing that, to justify the unspeakable violence that it took to smash black citizenship and create an apartheid society, that story was told. We heard that we saw that phantom of the black predator, and that image has been used as a slander against black men for a long time and to justify violence. And that was the story. That story was the one Carolyn told in court, but it also hung all over the courtroom, even if she hadn't testified. because the thing is, there was a local boy, white boy, whose father was a sheriff's deputy. He went off to school at Florida State. He came back to write a thesis for his in college, and he interviewed all of the 9 of the jurors, 9 of the 12 jurors, and they all told him that, of course, they knew that Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam had murdered Emmett Till, but that he had said something suggestive, to a white woman, and therefore he had it coming. That's why they voted to acquit. That story has had a lot of power in American history.
Yeah, it's getting the fair trial and also the accuracy of the reporting. I mean, I think journalists had a lot to do with the way this also happened, and at a time where we talk about fake news every day now. The real news that was coming out of that part of the country, it didn't seem to affect the jury because it was real. I mean, listening to you say that you spoke to a juror, it didn't matter. He spoke inappropriately. We knew he did it, and right. That didn't matter. So sometimes the real news doesn't even matter. Quickly, you talk in the book, I mean, we know the work of Jerry Mitchell in Mississippi. You talk about William Bradford Huey and his role. What briefly is when we yearn for great journalism and what it can do, tell us about that a little.
Well, there was a lot of great journalism around the Emmett Till trial. In fact, it's the first, really what we would call a media circus of the civil rights era, really of the post-World War II era. This is right after television has come into American life in a big way, still a new medium.
Right.
This became an international news story, and reporters came from all over the world to cover it. There was a forest of camera tripods out in front of that courthouse. And people didn't know that, when you're talking in front of a camera in Sumner, Mississippi, that you're talking to people in China. We know that because we're in a different age of awareness about such things. But anyway, this was a huge trial. The black press really did a great job. Looking back, when you read the different press reports, you realize that they knew what was going on in a way that the white press really didn't. But also, William Bradford Huey was a very ambitious magazine journalist. He wrote movie screenplays. Anyway, he was writing an article for Look magazine. Now, Look magazine was the largest circulation magazine in America. And he paid J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant several $1,000s, a lot of money in 1955 Mississippi, to tell about killing Emmett Till. They had to acknowledge that they killed Emmett Till to get the money, but they told a story, and this was a few months after they had been acquitted, and then they tell a story in which they acknowledged that they killed Emmett Till. I think that was the story that shaped our understanding of the Till case. I think people assume that if you admit to killing a 14-year-old boy, that you must be telling the truth about everything else. But every word in the rest of their story is not true. And the story you see, like in Eyes on the Prize, for instance, that's really their story. It's really narrated by the men who were part of killing Emmett Till, and they told about a boy so stupid, that he committed suicide by redneck in a certain way. He told them he had sex with white women. He was going to continue to have sex with white women. He was as good as they were. And on and on. This brash, defiant boy that their implication was, well, you would have killed him too. It was, and they framed the story in political terms. They said, I'm not, as long as somebody has to take a stand. That's as if that was why they killed him. And, as long as I've got breath in my body, Negroes are not going to go to school with my children. Negroes are not going to vote where I live because I'm not going to live under officials that are elected by black people. So that was their account. And that was what shaped our understanding. That's sort of the account that we're overturning here now.
Yeah, And I think, listen, the book, I think people are going to be writing a book about Emmett Till probably every 20 years for a while.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and this is a terrific piece of work you've done, Professor Tim Tyson. It's The Blood of Emmett Till. You can get this book at your independent bookstores. You can get it from independent bookstores online. It's a story that people should be telling, and without talking about it, I think that, and I think you would agree, Professor, we run the risk of being inured to these sorts of stories without looking in depth.
Absolutely. And we have another horrifying tragedy, and then 15 minutes later, we're on to the next horrifying tragedy,
Right.
without ever saying, like, how do we respond? How do we respond? What do we do about this? And that's really the important thing about the Till case, is showing us how we have the power to change the history in which we are ensnared. But we have to do that, deliberately, and understanding the situation we're in, like Mamie Bradley did.
Yeah, I think those are good words on which to end. Professor Tyson, thanks for coming into the Young Turks. Thanks for being
thank you so much for having me.
To our audience. Always so curious is our audience about the history, and so smart about wanting to make it better. So we appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it.